Hi, everyone, and welcome to our video podcast, hosted today, of course, by myself and our head of content, Tristan de Souza. Tristan, how you doing?
Yeah, not bad. There seems to be light at the end of the tunnel,
Okay.
at least insofar as the pandemic's concerned. But at least in terms of what we're going to talk about today, perhaps there is no light at the end of the tunnel. Perhaps we're just at the beginning of a very dark tunnel. But who knows?
Contrasted, yeah, with the big news coming out of Microsoft, Excellion, Qualysys,
Yeah.
STIA. We will talk about all of those cyber attacks. But first, I think to set the stage, as it were, you're right. I think there's a sense of optimism, at least here in the UK, about coming out of the pandemic. In the United States, it seems that they are making massive progress in some areas, having just recently passed a $1.8 trillion, I believe, a stimulus package.
Yeah.
How much of that money is going to go to cyber criminals, Tristan?
Hey, well, I mean, last month we discussed. Oh, good. Wait a second. Go to cyber criminals. Okay, okay, you got me. Well played. Well
All
played.
right. No, but I think this is something that we are going to dig into on this video podcast because very uncertain times in cyber. Microsoft's revelation that 4 0-days are being used by Chinese actors in a widespread Microsoft Exchange attack. They've been somewhat mute on whether or not that included attacks on Office 365, which is obviously their preferred platform now. I've always regarded Microsoft Exchange as a ticking time bomb in businesses, mostly because it has to be exposed to the ravages of the internet, that email is a fundamentally insecure way to communicate, despite all of the efforts that we've put in on top of it with various technological solutions. But I guess, Tristan, from your perspective, an attack on email, it hits businesses and organizations really close to home.
Yeah, that's a great point, both because of, as you say, its inherent vulnerability. If you're communicating all the time with email, if I get into your email, I can see pretty much all the stuff that you've said, and I can see all the stuff that your clients have said, and I can see all the transactions that have gone through that inbox. So yeah, I mean, on that level, a huge issue if this gets breached. I mean, in terms of the very fact that by its nature, email has to be open to the internet. I mean, I think over the last sort of decade or so, well, no, not over the last decade. I mean, it's a continual process of development, right? In terms of the fact that both ensuring employees know not to click on stuff, and also, having some faith in the service itself, I think, is an interesting thing, right? Because how far do you go down the sort of down the line of trusting these services? I think if you're a smaller business, or indeed if you're a relatively large business, you probably take on good faith the fact that a service provided by someone like Microsoft is gonna not have holes in it that are able to be ripped wide open by malicious actors, I guess, as a direct result of, as you first asked, as a direct result of the valuable information that's in there.
Right. And then, of course, it's the most common vector of attack for phishing emails, et cetera. And when, one trusted organization sends email to another trusted organization, there's a chance that within that fictional a bubble of trust, if you were, that confidential information, pre-market information, intellectual property information may be traded.
Yeah.
It's interesting that this Microsoft disaster / dumpster fire comes at the same time where we've seen revelation upon revelation in terms of SolarWinds. We're now up to 8 strains of malware that might have been contained within the Orion product. If this is an example of I would say, ensuring that you have integrity in your control and distribution of software, I mean, surely this should be a moment that will echo through history in terms of a supply chain data breach.
Well, isn't it interesting, Ian, that we continually say maintain your systems as up to date as possible, have a strong patch process in place, whether that's every month or whatever, with Patch Tuesday coming out, make sure you've upgraded your systems, make sure you've shut down your computer, blah, 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 blah. So like that is the messaging that has been going out and should go out and should continue to go out. But isn't it interesting that in the case of the SolarWinds debacle, those companies that had not updated their systems with the infected Orion update were not affected. So those people that had gone through the process of ensuring that their systems were up to date were the ones that then got infected. So, I mean, I think it's quite interesting in terms of what the messaging what the takeaway from this should be. Particularly since, last month we talked about Biden's big sort of his speech about cybersecurity, both within the government and the broader US, and then by extension, the sort of Western world. The focus on sort of defensive rather than offensive, and ensuring that, a secure perimeter is in place. It's very hard for an individual company to ensure that a secure perimeter is in place if they think that they're updating with a legit, update for their piece of software, and it's been hacked. So I don't know. I don't know what you think the takeaway from this should be, but for me, it's that everyone needs to switch on a little bit more.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, this is a wake-up call, but it's really interesting to me that when the Cambridge Analytica scandal happened, the digital media culture authorities here in the UK wanted and summoned various Facebook representatives, including members of Cambridge Analytica, to testify. We have not heard anything about SolarWinds and the government position on the SolarWinds data breach, other than a holding statement, I think, uttered from the NCSC that basically said, we're investigating the matter. Meanwhile, across the pond, as we like to say, congressional testimony, 3 government committees, including the Intelligence Committee, looking at this. One thing that isn't being talked about broadly, which I think it really should be, is that SolarWinds was used to infiltrate the Department of Justice and potentially expose records that are under seal of ongoing espionage, potentially counter-espionage investigations that are going on. So there are more tips to this iceberg than the one that sank the Titanic. and I think it's interesting because I think the experience that SolarWinds as a company is going through is something that is completely undesirable and is incredibly painful. I contrast this with Zoom, who was equally scrutinized for poor security behavior, who readily embraced the critics, who responded by making the necessary investments and saying, to begin with, you're right, our security had issues, our privacy had issues. We are going to go out and buy an end-to-end encryption company like Keybase. We are going to incorporate that into our product. We're going to embrace the criticism and improve ourselves.
It's really interesting that that's a comparison you've drawn. It's not one that I'd thought of myself, but I think it's a really pertinent one, particularly given the timing during a pandemic and the reliance of major corporations on both systems, right? Both Zoom and SolarWinds. I was revisiting a piece I wrote right at the beginning of the pandemic, actually, last year on Zoom. Recently, for some reason, I don't know why I was going through it, but how they were right in the limelight from the get-go at the beginning of this pandemic, whereby their system was taken up by hundreds of millions of people, and vulnerabilities were sort of exposed and analyzed in the cold light of day in the mainstream media, on the covers of the Times and the New York Times, which is not something that you would expect a small digital company or relatively small digital company to have had to deal with in a sort of what was essentially a beta testing phase of its product, right? But as you say, they were so open in the way that they held up their hands, said, look, yeah, these are issues. We are working to address them. And the rollouts were swift. Contrast that with SolarWinds, and they tried to blame it on an intern. So, I mean, corporate responsibility, fellas, is probably something they should look into. Yeah.
Well, it's really interesting to me that despite efforts at regulation, despite the SEC's involvement and the investigation, which may take years to unfold, the reality is that there's a lot of cyber insurance, property insurance for destruction of code and data claims being made against the SolarWinds data breach, potentially perhaps against the Microsoft Exchange 0 days. Is it possible that we'll see in 2021, as fallout from this, insurance companies taking a much harder line against companies with poor cyber hygiene, a massive increase in what do you call it, in the policy costs?
Yeah, the premiums. Yeah,
and then also in a situation where regulatory scrutiny is brought on the payment of ransomware through insurance mechanisms. Because I think those are some of the cleanup areas. I think in the committee hearings that I watched with regards to SolarWinds, Microsoft, and Mandiant, it would appear that more aggressive legislation is needed, because data breach now doesn't seem to be that to really matter that much.
Yeah, well, I hope so, is the short answer to your question. Are we going to see all of these things? Because frankly, we've been calling for it for the last 12 months, more on this podcast. Every month we seem to revisit the issue of, as I just said, the idea of corporate responsibility when it comes to the protection of data, both client data and employee data. The risks are clear, the costs are clear, but those costs being borne by an insurance industry that doesn't seem to impose penalties for these attacks having taken place is a mismatch. And I think for me, well, no, that's a match, isn't it? Is a mismatch. But for me, really what we need to see is perhaps industry-wide changes. And by that, I mean cybersecurity industry-wide changes, wherein everything is a lot clearer. Why is it so hard to compare and contrast products? Why is it so hard to know exactly what this product will do for your company? There needs to be a sort of much clearer grading system of these things that companies use to protect their most valuable assets.
I agree 100%. So Russia has been very naughty when it comes to especially the SolarWinds data breach. Chinese are in your mail servers. I noticed that Bloomberg attempted to resurrect the Supermicro story. Too much derision in the information security community about Chinese espionage operations again. Are we seeing the American recovery, which is inevitable? I mean, the stimulus, everything like that, the vaccine rollout, America is roaring to go, new administration, much more engaged than the previous administration. Are these cyber protagonists putting American recovery at risk?
Well, that's an interesting question, isn't it? I mean, I suppose there are several ways of looking at it, but as you said, that one, like the SolarWinds attack, for example, had it was an espionage attack. It had espionage written all over it. So if threat actors from another country, say Russia or China, since we've mentioned them and they are the big players at the moment and they're front of mind, if they're the ones that are looking to disrupt this recovery, they've probably already got the means to do it. They've probably already got the information to do it, or they've already got the access to do it somewhere that they haven't yet blown. But I don't know to what extent that would benefit them, because I guess China's economy, we have to take into account, is also massively dependent on American spending.
That's what I don't get. You know, what I don't understand is, okay, so even if China conducted a wide-ranging set of cyber attacks on exchange servers, they're interested in obviously stealing the intellectual property from those businesses, and, you know, creating the Chinese knockoff of whatever it is, from Predator drones to, you know, plastic doohickeys, right? You know, I get the level of harm that's happening there. It leaves American businesses wanting in terms of, you know, being undercut in the global marketplace. Whereas we have, you know, the exploit of that Acceleron FTP, secure file transfer server, being used by the Clop ransomware group and demanding millions in Bitcoin ransoms from businesses so affected. Qualysys enters the news of having been a serious security top flight vulnerability management company, only to expose a whole bunch of companies' vulnerability data. I mean, that's a tough one to walk back.
Yeah, for sure. I don't really see, I mean, I don't see how they come back from that, reputationally speaking. I completely agree. But I think to address your point about the Clop business model as compared to the cyber espionage business model, I think the Clop business model is a fantastic one. They have found
really well for those guys.
It's working really well for them. I mean, crikey, they found an inlet and they just walked straight through, and they have affected companies on every single continent as a direct result of a basic vulnerability in a file transfer server. That's big business for ransomware. I think, as you say, China stealing blueprints of aircraft, of weapons development, of let's say vaccine development, as well as almost certainly going to have been targeted, is a better way for them to make money than it is to undermine, I think, the American recovery. I think you made the point earlier on this week when we were talking about the American, this new stimulus, that actually it's more likely that Americans themselves will undermine their own recovery because they're such a split country. I
think you're 100% right.
You only have to look at what's happening, in the Senate when they're discussing these things. There is no unity. It passes because the Democrats have a majority, but then you go to Georgia, they control those houses. But I mean, for now, exactly. Yeah. But the Republicans are still trying to push through voter registration legislation. I think there's like 6 or 8. Particular things on the slate at the moment. And, that's just a microcosm. That's not economic recovery, but that's a microcosm of what it is that the American government faces when it tries to come to an agreement. And we see this every year, right, with the budgetary cliff edge, where they push each other to the cliff edge and over the cliff edge, and then they find the world's biggest parachute and somehow land safely. It's crazy. I think they're the only ones that are going to undermine there.
I think there's a certain level of audacity going on in the United States, and the battles between red state and blue state is intensifying, with red states essentially announcing that decommissioning mask mandates, much to the going against the current CDC guidance. It's interesting that structurally, the United States does not seem particularly strong. We saw the Texas power grid meltdown because of their reluctance to be federally regulated and adhere to FERC responsibilities. I get what you're saying, and I am deeply concerned because it would appear that we are 2 seats away in Georgia from having the Senate return to the Republicans, and then all of the progressive work that Biden wants to make would be stymied, and he would be forced to essentially run the Trump playbook, which is rule by presidential decree.
Yeah.
And so, it's interesting that these flaws are coming out. And I think one of the things that I found most interesting and recently was, if we look at Russian opportunism in the space to facilitate sort of the destruction of the Western way of life, the American way of life, by undermining trust, we've now seen the rise, I think, and apex almost of the damage that social media can do. I was acutely interested, as were most of the people here in the UK, with the Harry-Meghan interview. And I found one piece really compelling about how the media and social media was responsible for attacks on the institution of the royals, and how the royals seem to have been caught unaware at the power of social media to cause disruption. I'm wondering if we're seeing the equivalent of sort of the SWIFT attacks, where the International Monetary Exchange System got complacent, didn't understand the threat landscape. The same could be argued about SolarWinds. And all of a sudden, this new, extremely virulent, capable social media platform comes in to undo, tens, if not hundreds of years of establishment and sort of, I would say, culture. What do you think? Is Russia winning the disinformation? Have we built a society that's too precarious?
Well, are you saying that Russia was in some way responsible for the Meghan and Harry thing?
No, I'm just saying it's interesting to draw a parallel between how Russia utilized social media to further its efforts in disinformation, and how the social media platform, in the case of the royal interviews, was a contributory factor to a royal basically saying, I hate this job, I'm leaving.
Yeah, well, I mean, this isn't probably the podcast to be talking in such detail about the Meghan and Harry interview. But what I will say is, I do think the royal family probably brought about their own downfall by harboring certain malcontents within their own ranks and focusing on a mixed race American princess rather than the true criminals in their midst. But I think you're absolutely right. Social media was a contributing factor to Meghan's self-confessed suicidal thoughts, and the reasons behind one of the reasons behind Harry and Meghan needing to leave this country. And they did need to leave this country. They were hounded out of this country for sure. And I think that sort of virulence, as you call it, quite rightly, has been weaponized time and time again, right? In the last 5 years, we've seen it specifically by the Russians, particularly the Internet Research Center, the Russian troll farm that was taken down. Wait, is it the Internet Research Center? I think it is.
Yeah. That's what it was called.
Yeah.
The troll farm.
The troll farm. Yeah. And, they're good at this. That was low level stuff. That was, like, as was pointed out in an article earlier this week, that was an easy target for the West to go in, take it down, dismantle it, and say, we've won this battle. But it is only a battle, because the war, I think, as to get back to your initial question about whether whether this has created such instability in society, I think the war is that broader one, which is exemplified in the US by such a diametrically divided society, which can, I think, be brought together, but I don't presume to know quite how. I think it'll certainly take a few months. I mean, we're only in March, right? And he's only been president for a couple of months. So I think maybe that ship can slowly start to turn around. I think in this country we have our own divisions, Brexit primarily, and soon to be Scotland again. I mean, Scotland is rearing its ugly head, and that debate was only exacerbated by Brexit. And then more broadly, I think, around the world, Russia has attacked France. Russia has attacked other elections in other democratic Germany.
Recently,
yeah, right. So, I mean, they're not going to stop just because their troll farm was dismantled. But equally, how do you demonstrate to the Russians that how do you impose the cost on them, right? Like That's the thing. You can't. There was an interesting piece that I was reading about how, okay, they have engaged in an enormous and costly and very, very highly implemented espionage campaign through SolarWinds. But we do that too. We're great at that. Mm-hmm. The Five Eyes are great at espionage, and cyber espionage is probably now one of the key cornerstones of national defense. So without undermining our own moral authority by coming out and saying, hey, you did this is crazy, cannot believe you would have infiltrated SolarWinds like this and thereby the US government. In saying that, we gain nothing. In fact, we make ourselves out to be the hypocrites that we probably are anyway. But you can't really say that publicly. So how to impose costs, I don't know. How to turn the overall weaponization of social media around, that cat I do think is out of the bag. And I don't think it's going to go back in. What I think I've said on this podcast before, we need education, and I think education of the broader polity to be better placed to identify fake news, for example, to be better placed to critically engage with articles that they see online or are circulated on Facebook. And actually, I don't know what you think about this, but I was pretty pleased about Donald Trump getting shunted off Twitter, Facebook, YouTube. He's actually going to be allowed back on by YouTube very shortly. But I didn't see that as the great threat to free speech that many did. I don't know what you think about that. That seems to be quite a good way of tackling it, getting rid of your QAnons and getting rid of your Trumps. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm of two minds to that. Certainly, I think Trump is very divisive. It's not what America needs right now. I think America as a experiment is in peril, keeping in mind it is not that old in comparison to many other countries. Mm-hmm. It is going through a growth phase. I just hope that, it comes out the other side of it stronger, more engaged, and willing to participate on the world stage. My issue is, and it goes back to a question that I was asked almost a year ago now, about the difference between a long-term government like Chinese government and Russian government versus our 4-year or 6-year term-based government. And although I argued at the time that 4-year term-based government seems to be more agile, less potentially cult of personality driven, obviously Trump kind of threw a spanner into that argument of mine. But I often wonder that we don't seem to have the long-term strategic view in Western nations about how to overcome some of these endemic issues. And we are failing, I think, in one large-scale problem that we have yet to address in a effective manner. And that is, we built the world's largest machine, the internet. But we're trying to regulate it on national levels, and it's just not working. No. And everyone says, is the UN the solution to this? Well, it seems that the UN has its own problems of organization and government and being effective in holding nations accountable for their actions. But maybe that's an opportunity for the next podcast where we explore perhaps that we do need some sort of world leadership during this time to deal with the world issues, especially things like global climate change and the internet, which reaches every country in the world. But, in some cases, that country can decide to turn it off at whim.
Yeah, I do wonder there's a problem. I think that, we do have a relatively short-termist point of view in terms of government, but I think that's also undergirded, supported by the self-interest of the populations themselves, right? We've seen this in the pandemic, that many people have continued in sort of the way they wanted to lead their everyday lives. There were, lockdowns happened, but then I think after that, when there was sort of slight opening up, you can see that people will be able to switch off the sort of either the guilt instinct or the more broader impact, the knowledge that they clearly have of the more broader impact of their actions, if it gives them some sort of smaller, boost in the short term. And I think that in terms of very specifically the climate change, but also for internet oversight, makes me doubt whether we can get to that point. And I mean, I know that's a super negative way to view it, but I think self-interest trumps quite a lot of things. And in terms of the internet, people don't care whether their data is being used by Facebook, because it means that they get a putatively free surfing experience, browsing experience. So, like, yeah,
well, on that note, maybe what we'll do is we'll try and come up with some ways to fix a Pandora's box before it all falls out.
Yeah.
That's our podcast. Thank you for tuning in. And if you feel like subscribing, please click on the link.